If you'd like to turn in your Bible to Matthew chapter 26. Matthew chapter 26. Every now and then an article will come up on Facebook or online that I just think, I've got to see what this is about. And sometimes it's just life-changing, exciting information to find out. Like I had one this week that was on the average sermon length in Protestant evangelical churches. And I thought, now this I'm curious about. And so they've done polling data and research and all that stuff. And did you know that the average sermon is 37 minutes long? And I've always thought of myself as above average, so we might be here for a little while today. You don't know how good you have it. I've mentioned this to people before, I have a 26-minute internal clock. And you would be amazed the number of times that when I edit the video and audio on Monday, it's like right at a few seconds on either side of 26 minutes. So you get in 11 minutes less what everybody else gets in 37 minutes. So I struggled with this sermon because there are 14 sermons in Matthew 26 and 27. And so what I finally came around to is I'm going to do a few of them, and I'm going to do them on the Wednesday night scale. And so we're going to have a few of our little 6 to 8 minute devotionals all wrapped up into one here because there are too many good topics to ignore. And originally my plan was really to talk a lot more about the cross today, but we kind of are going to change that a little bit. I decided not to change the title because it is leading toward the cross. But most of our time we're going to spend this morning talking about the events leading up to it. So in Matthew 26, we're going to begin in verse 1. And I think what we're going to find here in this first little section is two ways that people can approach life. And it's kind of encapsulated in what Jesus does and what his opposition does. So Matthew 26, beginning in verse 1, it says, when Jesus had finished all these sayings, and that was, by the way, what we looked at over the last couple weeks about the end of the temple, the end of Jerusalem, the end of the world, his coming back, Judgment Day, all of those things. When he had finished talking about all of that, he said to his disciples, you know that after 2 days the Passover is coming, and the Son of Man will be delivered up to be crucified. And the way Jesus is going to approach the events of the cross and what's coming his way is through sacrifice and obedience. Now, he could have taken things in a different direction. We sing the song, he could have called 10,000 angels. You will find in the midst of this the idea that he could have called down 12 legions of angels to come and take over and rescue him. He could have changed what was going to happen. And instead, we know what he'll do. He's going to continue to obey the plan, as Dusty reminded us a minute ago, that was set forth from before time. This was always going to be what happened. And he's going to obey, and through that, he's going to be willing to sacrifice himself. Now, as he's having this conversation with his disciples, there's something very different going on among the religious leaders. In verses 3 and 4, it says, the chief priests and elders of the people gathered in the palace of the high priest, whose name was Caiaphas, and plotted together in order to arrest Jesus by stealth and kill him. And so what you have going on the other side is control and manipulation. Now, if I were to ask you, without looking at the verses we just looked at, which of these ways of approaching life do you see happening more in our world today, which one do you think it is? And we see it on the big scale. We see that going on over with Ukraine and Russia right now. The intent to control from one side and the just wanting to exist from the other side. You see this unfold all the time, that we want to control and manipulate situations. Even myself, I mentioned this morning, I was playing golf yesterday. I was playing by myself, playing golf, and I could have done anything to control and manipulate all of that, and I found myself struggling with that on occasion. No one would know if I moved this ball into a different spot. It's a really hard place to hit it right now. I have all different reasons. The course is in awful shape. I could excuse this in any number of ways, and I want to control it. How many times do we in the course of life get into situations where we want to control and manipulate the situation, or we want to control and manipulate the people that are around us? And even more interesting is in the next verse. But they said, not during the feast, lest there be an uproar among the people. So they may not acknowledge they're controlling and manipulating, but how are they doing this? They're doing it in secrecy. And generally speaking, when we're trying to hide what it is that we're doing, aren't we doing the wrong thing most of the time? I know every now and then we just try to, lay low and keep undercover with what's going on, but so often when we are trying to hide something, we know somewhere deep down that what we're doing is wrong. We know that we should be choosing a different path, and yet we're doing it anyway. And I think the religious leaders throughout this, there's got to be some small piece of them that realizes even if we don't like this guy, even if we're worried about our power, the way we're going about this, it's not right. And the fact that we're trying to do it in secret just shows that out. Now, next we'll see that there are two ways to respond to people and to situations. We have this story of the anointing of Jesus that takes place next. And it's one of those stories that almost feels out of place a little bit in the topics that are going on, but Jesus will use it to teach his disciples. It says that when Jesus was in Bethany at the house of Simon the leper, a woman came up to him with an alabaster flask of very expensive ointment, and she poured it on his head as he reclined at table. Now, get outside for a moment the idea that this would be very strange for us. We had a potluck last week. If you were to be sitting there at the potluck at one of the tables and someone came up to someone and just started pouring some sort of ointment or oil on top of their head, you would think that was the strangest thing you had ever seen. In his day and time, this was a thing of honor. And so what we find is they are acting out of gratefulness and out of honor. Their reaction to having Jesus there is they are grateful he is there and very likely grateful for what he has done. Because how is this introduced? It's there with Simon the leper. Now, what do we know about lepers in the New Testament? Lepers are nowhere around people other than other lepers. They are off on the edge of society. You don't come into contact with a leper, and so the fact that you're at a leper's house tells you that there's a very good chance here that this is a leper who was healed, which will bring the next question to us, well, who does that? Jesus does. So it's very likely you have two people here who their lives have been changed by Jesus. Because in the one, you have a leper hosting a meal where people are there. And then secondly, this woman who takes this ointment. And the way this ointment is described is it is very costly. And this ointment is put on Jesus' head. And so there is this great moment of honor and gratitude going on. There is just a display here that we cannot fully comprehend in our society today. And then we see the disciples' reaction to it. When the disciples saw it, they were indignant, saying, "Why this waste? For this could have been sold for a large sum and given to the poor." So their reaction is another way of reacting and responding to this. It is outrage. Now, just for a moment, if we could humor the disciples here for a second, are they correct in their assessment? Yes, it may seem like a lot of waste. And yes, this money could be taken and spent in a better way. And by the way, how often do we do this with one another? How often have you seen someone spend money on something and think to yourself, that money could be spent in a much better way than the way it's being spent? I struggle with this myself sometimes. There are ways that people spend money that I would think to myself, why would anybody do that? Why does that? There may have been some of you this morning, by the way, that would think, I wonder what it costs to play 9 holes at Lakewood Golf Course. And why would he spend his money that way? Or why would you spend your money on this or that or whatever? And we could, in our assessment, be correct. But on the other hand, do we have a lot of opinions about a lot of things that don't serve any purpose to share? And by the way, we talked about a church discipline this morning in Bible class here in the auditorium, and David started us off in Matthew 18, where a brother goes to a brother when there's trouble there. I wondered as I was sitting and thinking about those verses, how many of those situations could be avoided completely if we could just keep our opinions to ourselves? And by the way, I will frequently get somebody coming to me afterwards saying, "You really stepped on my toes this morning." I'm all over my toes this morning already. I have lots of opinions about lots of things, and I have a microphone. And so it'd be very easy for me to share lots of things that I think about any number of things, and sometimes it's better just to keep that to myself. And so the disciples, they're indignant and they think it, but then they say it. And Jesus calls them on it. And Jesus says, you don't understand what's going on here. And so we could react in gratefulness, and we'll talk more about that tonight, by the way. And we could react by honoring others, but so often instead in our world, we see outrage. And maybe we're already being challenged a little bit in these two different contrasts that we've looked at about how people interact with others and how we react to situations. How often do we see Christians, or maybe see ourselves, on the wrong side of these? How often are we the ones that are reacting in the wrong way? And then we're going to see 3 different ways to respond when things get difficult. Skip down a little bit here to verse 14. It says that one of the 12, whose name was Judas Iscariot, went to the chief priests and said, "What will you give me if I deliver him over to you?" And they paid him 30 pieces of silver. And from that moment, he sought an opportunity to betray him. This comes right on the heels of the story we read. There are a lot of people that think that as the disciples are indignant, maybe it's Judas at the top of that indignance. That maybe Judas, being the one who keeps the money and the one who likely is scamming off the top of the money, that he doesn't like it being spent that way and would like to instead see that money come into his coffers that he has control of. And so his reaction is betrayal. He doesn't like the way the situation is unfolding. As he tries to think of, how can I position myself in such a way that I can come out ahead here? This is not going in a good direction, and how can I profit from this? And then later in the chapter, in verse 30, it says, when they had sung a hymn, this is after they had taken the Last Supper together, they went out to the Mount of Olives, and Jesus said to them, "You will all fall away because of me this night. For it is written, I will strike the shepherd, and the sheep of the flock will be scattered." And later in that section, Peter said to him, "Even if I must die with you, I will not deny you." And all the disciples said the same. So maybe another option here when things get difficult is that we can deny. And we have probably run across this in one place or another where maybe someone denies through their action, maybe not quite as much through their words as Peter will. But maybe it's someone who claims to be a Christian, who is about the church, and goes out and lives a life that's different. As we were talking about church discipline in class this morning, I thought to myself, a lot of times the reason why that church discipline is not effective is because it is someone that is not so attached to the church that it is meaningful to their life in the first place. I think of back in John 9, if you were to look at that story, we won't look at it this morning, but there's a blind man who is healed. And he's questioned by the Pharisees and the religious leaders, and then at one point his parents are brought in, and they're questioned, and the way they react to the questions, it says they are fearful that they will be thrown out of the synagogue. I wonder to myself, how many people are actually fearful of the idea of not having church nowadays? I would imagine maybe there are some of us here who are. The idea of church being taken away from us in one way or another. I think of the people in Ukraine right now. I saw a picture that was posted of a city that is being bombed currently every day, throughout the day. And there is a group of Christians that are still meeting together in someone's apartment as bombs go off around them and worshiping. I cannot comprehend that. I cannot begin to understand what that was like. I wonder what the number on the board would be today if that's the situation in which we lived. It would be challenging for us, wouldn't it? To come up with any number of reasons that this is just getting too hard. And a lot of times we will look at Peter and we will shake our head and we'll think, Peter, you walked on water. Peter, the things that you saw. Peter, what you know. You walked with him. You were there. And you deny him. And yet what we just read, by the way, they're all going to in one way or another. And we get so hard on those guys, but what do we do when things get hard? When things get hard at a level that's not nearly what they're about to face. And so the one betrays and then more of them will deny. And then we see Jesus in verse 38. It says, he said to them, "My soul is very sorrowful, even to death. Remain here and watch with me." And going a little farther, he fell on his face and prayed, saying, "Father, if it be possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as you will." So you could betray, you could deny, but what Jesus will do is Jesus is going to persevere. Things are going to be even more difficult than they've been throughout life. Think of all the times where people have tried to trap him, all the times where people have wanted to come and take him by force. Think of him looking at those around him beginning to fall one by one, knowing that he would be denied, knowing that he would be betrayed, and knowing that he's about to be killed. And he could have done something along the way to stop it, and yet his prayer to God is, as much as I want that, not my will, but your will. He will persevere. What in our lives do we have that we struggle with, that makes us question God, that makes us question why we're doing what we're doing? What if, in those situations, instead of wanting to run, we would persevere? What if instead, looking for something easier, we will persevere through them? And so Jesus, he perseveres. And then there are, and we'll kind of bring this together, two ways to respond to failure. We all, at some point in life, most likely will fail. Now, there are a lot of you that I will look at your life and I will think to you, man, it always seems like they land on their feet. It always seems like no matter how things go, they come out just shiny and new from that. They come out ahead. They're able to show just great perseverance and they do things well. But for a lot of us, you could look back at life and you will think of there are a lot of failures in life. I had an assignment for the class I'm taking where I had to write a spiritual autobiography. All the things in life that I feel like had some sort of effect on me spiritually. I was amazed looking through those at the number of them that had to deal with failure. The number of times where God has really just dropped me on my back. Or maybe Satan has come in and put me on my back, and I have to decide, what am I going to do now? And sometimes it's quick, and sometimes it takes a while. But what are we going to do in the midst of failure? So we see first of all, we see Judas. It says when Judas, his betrayer, down in verse 27, verses 3 and 4, saw that Jesus was condemned, he changed his mind and brought back the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priests and the elders, saying, I have sinned by betraying innocent blood. They said, what is this to us? See to it yourself. I love how this starts out. Every time I read this, I want to not know where the story is going. Because what Judas does at first is the right reaction, isn't it? He has done something that is about as awful as you can imagine, and he realizes it. And his first reaction is repentance. I have messed up. I want to try to make this right somehow. Unfortunately, what we know about Judas from the verse that follows is Judas decides to end his own life. Now, I want us to understand here, we have all probably been touched in one way or another by suicide. We have had people close to us, friends. I'm not talking about some sort of a mental illness issue here. I know people do that for a lot of reasons we don't understand. There are those of us who will cast judgment on that and feel like it's a selfish act. Generally speaking, I think people are just broken to a point that they just don't see a way out, and they find their way there. And that's where Judas ends up. But where Judas ends up, it's not as a result of mental illness. It's all these choices that he has made, and he basically decides, I'm just going to give up. Now, for us, I don't think we are there when it comes to something like ending our lives, but how many times have we given up on God? How many times have we given up on situations? How many times have we given up on people? Have we just decided, I can't do this anymore, it's just too hard? Think of how many people who have been here as a part of the church before, who are not gone because church discipline took place, but because they gave up. Think of how many people just decided, this is too hard. I can't count on people. I have run into people in church settings who have been on the wrong side of all these responses to things that happen. They have been the people who acted out of outrage or who have acted out of judgmentalism or whatever it may be, and I'm just giving up on it. And maybe you find yourself on the edge of that today. Maybe you're at that point where you just think, I just don't know what to do anymore. If you are there, or if you know someone who is there, maybe if you're watching online because you don't want to be in a building, but maybe you're starting to open your mind back to God just a little bit, I want you to think of Peter. If we'll backtrack into the end of chapter 26, it says that Peter remembered the saying of Jesus. This is after he has denied him 3 times. He remembered what Jesus said, before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times. And then he went out and he wept bitterly. He is broken, absolutely broken. He is very likely in the same place that Judas is in the verses we just read that follow in chapter 27. He knows he's messed up. He doesn't know what to do to fix it. But what we learn about Peter through Scripture is he does something different. In Acts chapter 2, Jesus has risen from the dead. He comes back. He gives them a job to do. The Spirit descends on all of them. And then as they're all there with this great power of the Spirit on them, it says that Peter, standing with the 11, lifted up his voice and addressed them, men of Judea and all who dwell in Jerusalem, let this be known to you and give ear to my words. We know what follows if you've been around church for a while. Acts 2, this incredible sermon, less than 37 minutes, by the way. We know what's going to come after this. But how many people do you suppose, as Peter opened his mouth, had going through their minds, who does he think he is? You know, the disciples knew his story. The disciples knew as they gathered around that table. The disciples knew as they gathered in the garden. The disciples knew all of the things he would do. The disciples knew he had the faith to get out of the boat, but then sank, all the mistakes he's made, all the foot and mouth things. And then that Jesus said, you'll deny me 3 times. And Peter said, no, I won't. And then he did. And then he was broken and he went out and wept bitterly. How dare he be the one to open his mouth and preach this sermon? And yet he did. Because his response, rather than giving up, is to get up. And I hope that's where you are if you're on the verge of giving up today. That instead of giving up, instead of assuming there is nothing I can do to make this right, there is nothing God can do to redeem this, God can do more than you and I can begin to imagine. I heard a story this week. I don't want to get off on the tangent of the death penalty and what you think about it. There's a story this week about South Carolina. I don't know if you've read this. South Carolina, who used to do the death penalty by lethal injection, is having trouble getting the lethal injection drugs, I guess you don't call them medication, but whatever they are, to kill prisoners who have gotten the death penalty. And so they have brought back options to prisoners on death row. You may have the electric chair, once again, or you may have the firing squad. Do you ever think we'd have firing squad nowadays in 2022 America? They have brought back these as the two options. Now, I'm going to guess there will be court decisions that will probably overturn this at some point. But anyway, that's where they're at. What I will tell you, though, is, unless you're a gun enthusiast, maybe you have a gun on a necklace around your neck, but you don't have it there because of the firing squad. And I have never seen an electric chair necklace advertised anywhere. But what has God done with the cross? This instrument of torture, something that symbolized to the people of this day and time the worst way you could possibly die. Something that if they saw one, even if they weren't even beginning to be fearful of it being them, it would just send a little shiver up your spine to see it up there. He took that symbol and made it into something that's on the front of the pulpit and in glass in church buildings and around people's necks. If he can redeem that, and he can redeem Peter from the one who denies and instead becomes the one who preaches the best sermon ever preached, other than the Sermon on the Mount. If he can turn Peter into that, what can he do with your failure today? What can he do for you? And the question is, how does he do that? And he does that in a very simple way. In Acts 2:36, Peter will bring all his sermon together this way. This will be that we're about to stand and sing moment for Peter. Let all the house of Israel therefore know for certain that God has made him both Lord and Christ, this Jesus whom you crucified. How is this possible? Because they know Jesus is Lord. They had moments where they may have thought it throughout the life of Jesus, but then moments they began to doubt again. They had moments where they denied it, moments where they betrayed. But eventually they figured out Jesus is Lord. And the beauty of the story is, he still is. He is every bit as the Lord today that he was then, than he was when he came out of the empty tomb, than he was when he appeared to them afterwards. He is still that Lord today, and he wants to be Lord of your life. So the question for us today is, how are you going to respond? How will you respond to the message of Jesus? Will you be one who embraces him, or will you be one that goes off in the other direction? Today, I hope your life will be changed. I hope if you have fallen away from him that you will come back, or I hope if you have never followed him to begin with, that you will begin that walk and realize that it will lead you into places you could never imagine. Today, you can respond in the same way that 3,000 did. After Peter's sermon, you can be baptized into him, and you can walk a new life, or you can come back to him. If there's some way you need our help this morning as a church family, or you need to respond to his call, please come while we stand and sing.